Sup guys, I'm Xenaid, your local top infinite Sauron player, and I'm here to just give you a presentation on the good, the bad, the dinosaur. Kind of everything you need to know about deck building with Sauron. There won't be any gameplay, but we'll get right into it. So, when you're deck building around a card like Sauron, you want to think about the payoffs. Like, what are you playing the card for? For those of you guys who know at this point, Sauron turns off the ongoing abilities of cards, so you generally want him to play with high power ongoings. These are the first five you should be thinking of every time you play a Sauron deck. As more get released, it'll make Sauron a little bit more flexible, but really there's only five reasons to play Sauron. And the five reasons are right here. So we'll go to each five and kind of what makes them good and what makes them not good, and specifically what kind of decks they'll fit in. So we take a look at Ebony Maw, right? The little guys. So I split them off kind of by mana cost. You'll notice there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 reason to play him. Ebony Maw I would consider is no longer a pure Sauron card. I would consider him as a Nightmare card, which we'll get into later. The problem with Nightmare, with Ebony Maw, is he used to be a lot better played on 6 and 5. But the problem being that since Sauron only hits cards in the deck, a lot of the time he ends up as a dead card in your hand. Now, if you are able to play him early, it's going to be with 0 if he's in your starting hand, but the other problem with that is he dies as a Killmonger. So Ebony Maw is not one of the main reasons to play a Sauron deck. He is still playable, but definitely not consistent by any means. So you can probably make him work at lower levels, but kind of when you're trying to play a lot of games and win as many as possible, I wouldn't recommend that you run Ebony Maw. So one of the payoffs is kind of dead. We take a look at Lizard. So Lizard can be turned off either by Sauron or Luke Cage. He is a 2/6, a generic 2/6. At the time of this recording, a lot of the decks with in the meta fill the board a lot easier using Brood, Mr. Sinister, Mysterio. So Lizard generally is always a 2/2. However, his purpose in the early game is not to be understated because he does give early priority. Not many cards can compete with 6 power. So you're thinking about decks that want priority, right? When you're wanting to play Lizard. So if you're playing Iron Patriot, you might want priority. If you're trying to play Negasonic, you might want to have priority. And again, if I'm going over these cards, it's kind of telling you what they are. These is meant for a little bit more advanced players. So you can always look up the cards on the side. But yeah, decks that want priority generally want Lizard, right? You want to shut out your opponent from the game or interact with their plays. So like Juggernaut's another good example of a card that works with Lizard. A lot of decks you guys are used to seeing probably don't want priority. Like it's easier to understand like a Sarah Tech deck that wants to skip priority on the last turn so that your opponent, like you can Shang-Chi your opponent, you can Shadow King your opponent. However, Lizard's the opposite of that, where you actually do want priority to really maximize him when you play him early. When you play him late, hopefully he's turned off. But because if he's not turned off, he's generally a 2/2, right? And you don't really want a 2/2 that does nothing a lot of the time. All right, Starbrand, the star. So he's honestly the reason why Sauron works. Around the time that I was coming back to Marvel Snap, Starbrand was released, and without this payoff, the other cards just aren't good enough to make Sauron work. The first thing is he's low cost. So 3 cost is kind of a premium cost in Marvel Snap because 3 cost is basically what you're always able to play 2 of on the last turn, right? Unless Sandman ever becomes meta, but we don't really need to talk about that. So like if you notice any 4 or 5 cost, you can only really reliably play 1 card, one of on the last 2 turns. So Starbrand lets you play a 3/10 aside your net last turn plays. Which makes deck building with him a lot more flexible. You can play a 3/3, a 3/2, a 3/2, and a 1. And it really does make your last turn play less predictable. Now, his downside is actually not that much of a downside considering Marvel Snap's only a game where you have to win 2 lanes. So the math on that is basically he's a 3/10 in the lane that you're in and he loses 3 power he loses 3 power in another lane. But that 3 power is a lot of the time going to be irrelevant if you're playing a deck like a Sauron deck because you want to go bigger anyway, right? If you're going to lose the lane by 3 power, it honestly doesn't happen that much. You can honestly play him without downside a lot of the time, or without negating him. His downside is almost negligible if you don't need to go really wide. He honestly did save the archetype because these other cards are not playable very much with Sauron. Going into the power cut big guys, Typhoid Mary is like pretty criminal. Again, she has the same downside of Lizard, whereas like if you want to play Lizard and Typhoid, you can honestly just be running Luke Cage. There's no reason to run Sauron without the existence of Starbrand and Red Skull. Again, Ebony Maw's not a card. So Typhoid Mary's biggest thing is she's very location dependent. There's a lot of locations that want you to play multiple cards in the location, and Typhoid is bad in all of those, right? However, there are some locations that are restrictive, like Space Throne, like Atlantis, where you only want one card, and generally Typhoid is good in those locations. She's also a lot better on turn 4 than she is on turn 6, assuming you can't turn her off. If you can't turn her off, obviously we're talking about all these cards as if they're not turned off, right? Because if they're turned off, they're just generic stat sticks. However, if you cannot turn Typhoid off, then she's going to lower the power of all your other cards. And it goes to 4/6, 4/8, 4/4. And you're not running a pure 4/4 in your deck, right? So you want to account for turning Typhoid off as much of the time as possible. Now, it's also another card that's good for priority, because if you slam down a 4/10 in an empty lane, like let's say it's Asgard, you can really just threaten that lane. Like, your opponent's not going to go over that with just one card a lot of the time. And that's what Sauron decks are good at, right? You represent your power in one lane, and you say, have an answer for this, be able to go over it. If they can't, they generally have to play for other lanes or have answers such as Shang-Chi. Now, another bridge use for... another side use for Typhoid is, like, sometimes she will lower your Starbrand to 8 power, and in a Shang-Chi lane, that's pretty nice. Since a lot of people are expecting Shang-Chi to win the lane with Typhoid in it, because if Shang-Chi hits, he's a 4/13. However, if Typhoid can reduce the power, then he becomes a 4/3, right? So if you can Typhoid on that lane, and then like play another card in another lane, Typhoid is really good at kind of cheesing their Shang-Chi lane some of the times. Yeah, but she's not one of the best cards in the deck. Red Skull is, however, one of the unique reasons to play Sauron, because the only way you can turn him off is with Sauron R0. And in this meta currently, as this video is going to be released, Cerebro is being played. Cerebro has recently been buffed. He gives +3. And there's only one card that increases your opponent's card's power in the game, and that is Red Skull. So if you can play an activated Red Skull, not a turned off Red Skull, it'll instantly make 2 of the Cerebro's lanes maximum like 12 or 10 power. Now, when he's negated, he is a 5/14, which is the most premium stat line of the 5s. I believe the next 5 drop of highest power is a 5/9. So there's not that many 5/10s, if any. So he is like very premium in terms of what power he's able to offer. However, a lot of decks are filling the board, and so he's a 5/6 baseline. So in order to play these cards, you really want enough reliable ways to turn them off, or you want to like play a certain amount so that, let's say you have 0 or Sauron, you don't mind drawing it because you can only 0 one of them, right? So in terms of turning them off, like I said, you don't really care about turning off Starbrand. In this current meta, you don't always want to turn off Red Skull, and you kind of do always want to turn off Typhoid, depending on the deck you're playing. So I would say these 3 big cards are kind of what makes Sauron decks playable. Lizard and Ebony Maw, just, there's a lot more better small cards that do power multipliers a lot better, and they're kind of being edged out of the meta currently, all right? So now that we're done talking about the payoffs, we're going to look at, oh, sorry, I went backwards. We're going to look at the enablers, right? And so the enablers in this deck are cards that make your payoffs better. So these are the payoffs, these are the enablers. Sauron ultimately is the best enabler, right? But you got to think about what else lets you play these cards. And the first card that should come to mind is 0. Because 0 is the card that kind of shares the effect with Sauron. Let's say he's not in the deck. While you miss it, well, that means that you can still play 0 plus 1 card. And the goal is to play more than 1 card in a turn, once you realize that you have to play 0 plus 1 card. And if you know you're doing that, then discounts are the way to go with building a Sauron deck. So Mobius does hit Sauron decks pretty hard, but the problem why Sauron's pretty good into Mobius is that if they're playing a 3/3, you're playing a 3/10. And so Mobius is just enough of a tempo loss where you can do better things each turn that you don't care that your discounts are being turned off. And you also run Enchantress, so if your discounts do matter a lot of the time, Enchantress has 2 purposes in a Sauron deck. You run her to turn off your ongoing effects, as well as turn off your opponents. So that's what makes Sauron pretty terrifying when ongoing metas exist. Now Enchantress is kind of a double-edged sword. It's not very big, so it's like kind of playing at a tempo loss when you're playing Enchantress out, but sometimes in certain metas, that's just what you'll have to run. However, I think the 2 new cards that have been released recently that make Sauron a lot more playable, as he seemed like he was dying, is Surge and Mr. Fantastic. Surge especially is, with Zabu, you can make your 4-drop top decks cost 2, and you're adding more power, right? So you're making your good plays even better, and it allows you to fit more cards in one turn. Even though Sauron's really about slamming these big guys, like Typhoid and Red Skull, being able to slam another card aside them really makes your turns a lot more unpredictable for your opponent, and it makes the deck building question a lot more interesting, right? Mr. Fantastic also is just a criminally good card right now. I don't know what state he'll be in the future, but getting +2 power or a 1 discount helps you either go over the top a little bit more where you weren't able to, or it just lets you, again, keep playing those additional cards per turn. Again, a Sauron deck doesn't need as much power, but if your opponent's expecting a 10 power play and you have a 12 power play, then it does help you kind of win those high cube games a little bit more. All right, so that's pretty much the enablers. They're generally going to be low cost because you can't really enable a card aside a big turn play. Like, you can't play a 4-drop and Typhoid Mary on the same turn. You can't play a 4-drop and Red Skull. So I believe these are all the enablers. If you decide that you've tried other ones that work, let me know. Enchantress sometimes does get cut depending on how many of the payoffs you're running, just because she is expensive and it's hard to make her playable alongside the other cards, right? Just at base value, Starbrand, Typhoid, and Red Skull, you have to spend 1 turn playing them and then Enchantress them on the next turn, if you're not getting any discounts. So that's why sometimes it's easy to cut Enchantress from these lists, because you don't really want to be forced to commit 2 cards to 1 lane, right? So let's talk about another card that's very kind of adjacent to building Sauron, which is Skaar. Now, Skaar doesn't always have to be built with Sauron. In the recent months, we've seen Skaar Thanos be a big thing. However, Skaar is very good with Sauron because when you're able to play these raw vanilla cards, Typhoid is one of the better 4s that you can play that is a 4/10. And we'll talk about kind of the others right now, right? You have Ares, which hopefully becomes a 4/12. Good synergy with Red Skull, Starbrand, Typhoid in the deck. He's almost always proccing. No one's bigger than you. You're the biggest. You're the best. Collapsidian is good because all the enablers in the Sauron deck are 1-drops. So you'll see, again, Sauron, Zero, Zabu, all 1-drops. So a lot of the time, you're just able to play that Collapsidian. And if your 1-drop gets discounted to a 0, then Collapsidian is basically a free play. You can play him any lane, whatever. Atuma, Crossbones are there on the bottom just because they're Series 3 replacements. So there's interesting deck building things you can do, but we'll talk about the upside downside in a sec. And then Surtur itself can be good Skaar build, but I think Starbrand is just a better play on turn 3. Surtur itself can't get Shang-Chi'd, which is good a lot of the time, but if you're trying to go for the full Skaar game plan, getting him to a 1 cost or a 0 cost with the discount game plan is actually very good. And I think the two really enablers of a Skaar archetype is Zabu and Surge. Because when Skaar gets discounted once, he's 5. However, the real breakpoint was when he gets discounted twice. When he gets discounted twice, he's 3. So again, you can't play a 3+4 on turn 6. But if any of these get hit by Zabu or if any of these get hit by Surge, then all of a sudden you have a 3+3 play and it's 20 effective power on the last turn. So let's say they have a Shang-Chi. Well, okay, you can Shang me in 1 lane, but I'm dropping 20 power elsewhere. And that's kind of the goal behind the Skaar archetype, which is you want to get as many 10s out as possible with as little downside as possible. So looking back at the Sauron cards, you don't mind playing Starbrand on 3 with a downside, because he's still a 10 that's reducing your Skaar. You don't mind playing Typhoid into an empty lane, because let's say Typhoid in an empty lane is 10, and you play another 10 on her, well, it's still 18 power in a lane, which is pretty respectable. But the other thing she's doing, being played raw, I would say, is discounting your Skaar. Red Skull itself, okay, I would never play this card raw, but he's kind of more an alternative line, because if you get 3 Skaar discounts, he becomes 1 cost, so Skaar plus Red Skull becomes possible. But that's inherently the Skaar synergy with Sauron. Let's talk about the Skaar cards themselves, because none of these are really Sauron-specific cards, right? They're kind of Skaar cards. And so when you look at the Skaar cards, I put them in best to worst. Ares is by far the best Skaar card. When you play Ares, you're getting information asymmetry. You will be better at using Ares than your opponent will be. The easy way to use Ares is he reveals the power of the next 3 cards in your deck. So you look at the power of the next one you draw. Let's say you have a common example with this deck is, let's say it shows 34 and you draw Red Skull. Well, 34 takes out the 14, you have 20 left, which you're drawing 2 10s, right? Let's say your deck is running Alioth, and Alioth is 9 power. Well, if you draw 33 and you pull Red Skull, you have 19, which means Alioth is going to be 9, and then you get a 10. So Ares really does help you predict your future turns, and your opponents probably aren't thinking about this as much as you are. Another really good use of Ares is kind of predicting how much power negative will be drawing, or what deck, like what negative has in hand. So for example, if you play Ares on 4 or even on 3 and you see that the negative player has -1, I was like, okay, negative is one of their next draws. If you see they have like 9 power, oh, you know Jane Foster is coming. If you know it's like 0 before a flip, then all of a sudden you know it's like Gore, Iron Man, something like that, right? So there's a lot of Ares math that helps you win games, and it helps you minimize max your cubes, because you know what your opponent is drawing, and that's a lot of information if you're able to use it effectively, right? And Ares also, as opposed to these other cards, has no restrictions on where you want to play him. You can play him almost in any lane. The only downside of Ares, obviously, is sometimes 6 is less than 12, which is better than 10. So 6 is less than 10, really hurts your Skaar game plan if you don't hit it. But with the way you build your deck, most of the time you're hitting it, right? Cull Obsidian is great with the Sauron list, again, because of all the 1-drops. I think effectively you need 3 1 costs to make him worth playing. When Sam Shield was a free 1 cost, you only needed like 2. But you really do want either Sauron, Zero, or Zabu on the field by the time you're playing the Cull Obsidian. Just know, like, if you're not drawing one of these 3 cards, you're probably dead anyway. So it's saying, like, okay, in a game where you have a decent draw, Cull Obsidian is almost always able to be played. However, you do have to plan for him, so you're never really playing Sauron plus Zabu or Sauron plus Zero in the same lane. Don't get too greedy, because you'll get really punished if you put 2 1-drops in the same lane. That'll make it so your Cull is your 3rd card in your lane, and your power max cap will be like 22. So you do really have to plan lanes ahead of time to play this Cull Obsidian card. Surtur itself is good. Like I said, it is a power card that doesn't get up to 10, so that's my gripe with playing him in Skaar, just because you do want cards that get to 10 very effectively. Now, he's good in locations that give him +1 power, because he becomes a 10. But again, when things interact with your power like that, if there's better cards to run, I think I was playing Surtur, and then I cut him for Mr. Fantastic, because Mr. Fantastic with a discount allows you to do some other shenanigans that I'll get into a little bit later. But Surtur is by far like not a bad card at all to run into Skaar. I just had to make a tech decision, right? These last 2 cards are here. It literally says they're Series 3 cards, because they are. They're Series 3 cards and they're playable. Crossbones forces you to overcommit into a lane. Just think about, like, on turn 4, if you're winning a lane, you're most likely having one of your 10 costs down. So, like, by turn 4, like, you're going to play 2 10s in one lane, and you're like, okay, shang me here, I guess. Which is sometimes a good thing if you know where they're going to shang you, because you can play around it. But a lot of the times, like, it really forces you into an uncomfortable spot. You don't want to see 20 power in one lane. That makes you really vulnerable to tech, unless you know their deck isn't running Shang-Chi. Atuma, again, is really subject to location variance. Atuma itself is a very good card in terms of clogging your board space. However, it does kill your lower costs. And when you look at your lower costs being Sauron, Surge, you don't want those to die. You don't want Fantastic to die. You're okay with Zabu dying, but then, again, when your 1 costs die, all of a sudden, your Cull becomes harder to play, right? So, again, Atuma has the same problem of relying you to play 2 10s in one lane. So they know they have to either beat 10 or 20. And you don't really want to give your opponent that much access to information. It's either 10, 20, or 22, right? In the Atuma lane, because he's going to be killing off the low cost. You'll see Zabu and Surge hiding in the back of these, because all these cards are 4 costs. The entire goal of the Skaar game plan is to play a 3 plus a 3 on the last turn. If you are not running Zabu Surge, you cannot play the Skaar game plan as effectively, just because it's hard to get 2 cards onto the last turn. So hopefully that makes a lot more sense for the Skaar army. Like, this is a deck building video, so I'll show you my choices with this later. But again, replacements, Crossbones, Atuma. In order, Crossbones is better than Atuma, I believe. Because let's say you want to play Lizard or you want to play Zero Maw, you can still play Crossbones on those lanes. So, like I'm saying, yeah, you're learning how to build a deck flexibly here. And why you should put certain cards in and when you should, right? I'm not telling you kind of play these cards here and there. I'm kind of giving you the options. And if you want to put in the comments any other options that you think might be good, then let me know and I can kind of tell you my thoughts on them. Or you can message me them on Discord as well. All right. So going on to the next one, we talk about my personal nightmare. My personal nightmare is this card Nightmare. So Sauron, if you don't know, got changed to hitting all cards in your hand in your deck to own your deck. And then Nightmare now fulfills the second purpose of changing the costs of cards in your hand. You can see our little boy Ebony Maw hanging out with this Nightmare card because it's a Nightmare card now. You really just want to hit it when it's in your hand. You don't want to really play it out early because it's one of a Killmonger. And the other card that's really emphasized here is Merlin. I do not think you can play Nightmare without Merlin effectively. If you are, you probably have to retreat a lot more times. A 3-1 is pretty bad. Like, it's not as strong as Mr. Negative, which gives you a game-winning effect. Nightmare just gives you a sometimes, like, game-winning effect, but sometimes it's just mid, right? So the problem with the Sauron and kind of these kind of decks is you want to be pushing out power. Like, the difference between playing a 3-6 or a 7 power or anything on the board is you're literally spending your turn 3 playing -1 power for sometimes the payoff. So the ways to offset it is by playing Merlin. You can get the 2 spells Onto the Future, which gives you extra energy, or you can get Polymorph, which turns them into a 4-drop. Both of those are really good. But see how many cards you have to kind of build around this if you're playing Nightmare and Merlin? There's suddenly like 6-7 other cards. I put these here on the purpose of Sauron deck building, but the problem with Sauron decks is also you don't have a lot of things you want to hit with Merlin. You don't really want to polymorph the Sauron cards, and you don't really want to Onto the Future the Sauron cards. Because, like a 1-3, right? That's already premium 1-drop stat lines. When you're evolving it to a 2-drop, a lot of the time you're not getting a better 2. Even, like, your 1-3, you don't want to send back into the deck. It's much better to send, like, a -1-3 to the deck. A negative 1 power, right? Or maybe the Sentry Void. But you don't really want to have too much tempo loss when you're playing a Sauron deck. So the kind of concept between Nightmare and Sauron is a little bit contradictory, right? But if you do want to play Nightmare, then here's the options, right? Here's the options I found out that work out the best. You want to do anything that stops you from losing tempo. So you can play Cersei Annihilus. And then when you play Cersei Annihilus, you want to play other cards that synergize with them, right? Like Sentry Hood. I have Giganto here instead of Infinite because I prefer being able to play my card if I don't draw my card that turns it off, obviously. Like, Infinite is great, but you're not running War Machine with Sauron. You'd rather run the Rem deck, right? This is purely for Sauron deck building perspective. Like I said, if you don't have Merlin, do not bother with Nightmare. I would just say it makes it so much worse. And then the other thing is 5 costs with Nightmare are insane. A lot of the 5 cards are like low power. Hobgoblin is the worst one to get because it gives them the 5 cost, but if they're filling up, it doesn't really matter. Like, the goal is Red Skull is the 5 cost you want to hit. But you can get a 5-7 White Tiger, you can get a 5-8 White Tiger, you can get a 5-7 Iron Man, you can get a 5-7 Prof X. Like, a lot of these 5 cost effects are game winning if the 5 cost is low power, right? Even like a 5-7 Blue Marvel, like, that's pretty good. I think 5s have the most flexible effects, and also it's just because you want to be playing more than 1 card per turn, right? So you want to be playing like a 5+1, 5+ Merlin spell, etc. But that's kind of the concept between Nightmare deck building versus Sauron deck building. Like, Nightmare is its own archetype. The only overlap is that they both want to play big cards. However, the big cards for Sauron, as we go back to them, the one that really is good with Nightmare is Red Skull. 4-drops aren't necessarily that good. As you can see, there's like infinite 4-10s in the game, so like there's no reason to have to run Typhoid Mary with a Nightmare deck. And then Starbrand, the 3s are good, but like not that game winning. So like I'd rather just play a naked Starbrand than like get Deathlock or something off of it. You can get Brood, you can get Surfer, but a lot of times the effects aren't good enough to justify the tempo loss you're getting from playing Nightmare unless you're gonna turn things off. I would say that probably Ebony Maw is like the best thing. Lizard, there's no reason to play Lizard with Nightmare when Maximus also exists, because the Lizard downside is worse than the Maximus downside when you play it late, which is kind of what you want to be planning for when you play Nightmare, right? You want to be playing cards late. You don't really care about priority because, I mean, you're playing a 3-1. Like, how could you care about priority? And you can't manipulate priority that well because you can't run tech. If you run tech, Nightmare just turns it all off. You can't play Juggernaut. You can't play Shang. You can't play Enchantress. It's really tough, right? For these cards, you don't care if they get turned off or not because you have multiple ways of getting rid of things, right? I would even consider running Viper, but let's say your Annihilus gets turned off. You still have Misery to kill some of these cards. You still have Cersei. You might get a Merlin spell, right? There's 3 ways in itself. So you really want to have like those backup routes when you're planning a Merlin deck, right? All right, our actual Nightmare. This card, Shang-Chi. So despite Shang-Chi existing on the meta, it's what separates the good Sauron players from the great Sauron players. There's only so much you can do in the deck building phase. If you don't like losing to Shang-Chi, I would probably not play Sauron, but if you want to beat the Shang-Chi players, don't allow your power to be controlled. I put kind of cards that are effective at dealing with Shang-Chi. Alioth is the best one, and the release of Mr. Fantastic First Steps has allowed Alioth to come back into the meta. I'll kind of go into that with my next deck. Juggernaut does its job, but you'd have to build the deck specifically for Juggernaut, just because, like, okay, if there's Shang-Chi one lane and you hit him into the other lane, it's still a 50-50, right? So you're hitting Shang-Chi into another lane, then you might just kill your 10 cost over your 10 power cards over there. Armor and Cosmo have been considerations. They were run with Sauron in the Shuri days back in the day, but nowadays it might even be acceptable because Sauron doesn't turn them off if they're in your hand. I would consider deck building with that and let me know your results. However, they're just kind of tempo lossy cards, especially because Cosmo has a much better effect when you can play him late game, except with Sauron a lot of the time, you're not playing a Cosmo late game. They're good for surprise factor. If you play both of them, then maybe you can kind of like cheese out people staying on Shang-Chi and just getting blown out by these cards. I'd try it, but right now it's just not what's been working for me. All right? If you do run one of them, I would probably run both of them for consistency effect. Let's say Sauron turns off one of them, then you still have the other one in your deck or in your hand, so that way you can still surprise your opponent, right? So yeah, that's kind of how you deal with Shang-Chi. And now let's get into some actual decks that I have, right? The One Trick Tourney just happened, and this is the list that I brought to the One Trick Tourney, the most reliable one. If you don't know about the One Trick Tourney that happened, it's where a lot of people who play only one deck in High Infinite just match against each other. I might put a video out kind of analyzing some games for that, depending on feedback from this video and such. If you're still here, obviously, hopefully you're getting something valuable from this content. So kind of look at the curve spread of this deck. You'll notice that going from 1 to 3 drops, I have all the enablers I mentioned earlier. The only enabler I cut out is Enchantress, and I'll explain that why in a sec. But Zabu gives discounts, Sauron turns off the cards, Zero turns off the cards, Fantastic gives discounts, Surge gives discounts. 5 discounting cards. And the ultimate discount at the end is Skaar. Now, I talked about Skaar going to 5 and going to 3. Here's the really fun interaction where Skaar gets to 1. Now, Skaar gets to 1 in exactly 3 circumstances. Or actually, 2. Skaar gets to 0 in exactly 3 circumstances. 1. Your Surge hits it. 2. Your Fantastic hits it. 3. Okay, something else discounts it. But the more important thing is that you have to play Starbrand or a Ares or a Typhoid on 3. You need a discount to play a 10 power card on 3, 4, and 5 so that Skaar gets all 3 discounts. Now that's sometimes hard to do. Sometimes you get like the Hulk location or you get Monster Island, which makes it a lot more fun to do. But the reason it's so valuable with this deck is because the other card that can get discounted is Alioth. So when Skaar gets to 1, you can play him and Alioth on the same turn. That is essentially shutting down your opponent's Shang-Chi and auto-winning another lane. And that's kind of the core concept in playing this deck. You get those 8 cube high rolls because no one's really expecting Skaar plus Alioth on the last turn, and it's something really hard to play around on ladder. So considering Skaar plus Alioth is my game plan here, I have to look at all the other cards in the deck, right? And so I just decided to play all the Sauron cards. Just because I'm playing Sauron, I want 3 payoffs for him. The 3 payoffs are Starbrand, Mary, and Red Skull. Lizard and Ebony Maw become a lot worse here because they don't support the Skaar game plan, right? So you want as many synergy pieces as possible. The other thing with Lizard and Ebony Maw is that with Ares, they're a little bit weaker and they kind of mess up your math. Like, you kind of want to have kind of consistent math for Ares to hit every single time. So really important to use Ares to get as much information out as possible. Really the game plan is play your enablers on 1 and 2, get discounts, slam down big cards on 3, 4, and 5, and then surprise them on turn 6. The surprise factor comes from both Surge, Mr. Fantastic, and Skaar. If they're not thinking about those 3 exact things, you can cheese out a lot of wins, and I mean a lot. And so that's kind of the list. Most decks can't go taller than this. One of the ways to deal with my nightmare that is Shang-Chi is just put enough power in all 3 lanes. A lot of tech decks are very cheesy, and they do run Shang, but Shang is the only tech card you die to, and Juggernaut. Problem with Juggernaut being that you have enough power, so if they're spending a turn Juggernauting you, he only had 3 power to a lane, right? So if you're not, like, just only winning by 2 or only winning by 1, which doesn't really happen in this deck. You want to be aiming to win a lane by like 5, which is really easy to do when you have 10 power cards, right? So then the last thing is like Shang plus Jug is usually how they'll get you. The meta has kind of warped to buffing, so if they play Fantastic, Fastos, Gwenpool, sometimes they are able to outpower you, but if you want to play Sauron, you just have to deal with that reality that you might have to retreat if they get 3 buff cards that enable their brood to be a 3/30. I recommend everyone retreat once you see Fanta, Fastos, and Gwenpool playing in that order, because they can have up to 20 power of buffs in their hand. But again, that's just something to consider. But hopefully you can understand kind of the logic behind this deck through kind of what I went to consider. Red Skull is kind of really important right now. I would never cut Red Skull nowadays because Cerebro is being played a lot. When Cerebro is being played and they play like a Nightcrawler or they play like a Bast out early, you do not want to play Sauron unless Red Skull is already in your hand. That being said, Red Skull will win you 8 cubes in those games if he is not turned off. If I know people are Cerebro players on ladder, I purposefully do not turn off my Red Skull, or I will snap them if they know that I'm playing Sauron, and I'll just have them retreat for 1. Cerebro's an unplayable matchup in this deck. Also, Tribunal and Cerebro are the 2 matchups I would consider this deck very good into, because you can just go tall. If you can play 2 10s in a lane, that's 20 power. You go a little bit taller than that. You go to 30 in each lane. If you're really only playing for 2, a lot of times that doesn't happen. You really want to play tall with Sauron decks rather than wide. And that's just something to consider as you're playing your games out. If there's enough interest, I'm probably going to analyze my one-trick tourney games as well as play some games on stream. You'll catch me. You can always request me to kind of coach you on this deck. It's kind of my bread and butter at this point. As I was building this list, I was like, okay, well, let's see if I can use the deck building concepts to kind of go into a different Sauron deck. So I built this deck while creating the slides for this video, and basically it's a Skaar-less version of the deck, right? Like, why would you run Lizard? Again, I think Ebony Maw's a dead card, but I do think Lizard does have some merits, right? So the merit of running Lizard in this deck is basically early prio. You get early prio because you ideally want to remove a card from the Lizard lane. So Juggernaut and Lizard are synonymous, because if you can Juggernaut the Lizard lane, then all of a sudden they can never fill it. Now, it's bad when Mysterio's meta, but it's pretty good for now. I've also run Electra in Sauron decks when 1 costs are very meta, because Electra also clears out the Lizard lane. Think about like when Batroc is being played, Sunspot is being played, Misty Knight is being played. You can play Lizard comfortably onto those lanes, so that way you can Electra them later. Again, that's a deck building concept thing, right? What makes Lizard good? Them not having empty lanes. So Killmonger. Killmonger's a lot more playable in Sauron, but then you're killing your own 1/3. So Killmonger's good with Lizard, not good with Sauron. But yeah, think about these things as you're trying to build a Sauron deck. I'd be interested to see if you are able to make something that's successful yourself. Why can I run Juggernaut in this deck? Because I'm running a lot more lower power cards. In the previous deck, all my cards are 10 power or higher. So like, even if I Juggernaut somewhere, it's going to kill something. With this deck, it's a lot easier to control because you can play a Lizard Surtur lane, which cannot be shamed, but does have respectable power. And then you can play your Red Skull, your Starbrand, your Enchantress, your Ares in another lane, and that's the only Shangable lane. If you can narrow down their Shang options to 1 lane, then that makes Juggernaut a whole lot better, because you can just slam Juggernaut on that lane, and it's basically like you had a 3-cost Goliath, right? Because if Shang goes elsewhere, it doesn't matter. Now, it is weak into the tech decks that run Mysterio, because again, they can still fill, so don't rely on Juggernaut not too much, but this is a better deck when there is Mobius, because this deck does heavily rely on discounts, right? Like, if you're able to discount cards, you can play 2 per turn. However, if you are not able to discount your cards, all of a sudden you're stuck at 1 card per turn, and this deck does not run Enchantress. However, this deck, if there's a Mobius out, you can also Enchantress it, right? So this is just kind of my thinking in building decks to answer the meta and such. Like I said, a lot of us probably watch videos. Shout out to KM Best, Postglazer for creating those videos, but I would highly encourage us to kind of put some thought into our deck building, especially in the lower levels of Infinite. No one's really thinking about the choices you make in your deck, so if you can find some good answers to certain metas, you can have a lot more success. In higher Infinite, it's a lot more important to run these hidden tech cards, because everyone knows what you're doing, right? Like, when you're playing a Sauron deck, everyone knows that you're just going to get Shang-Chi'd and lose, or you like have Juggernaut to play around Shang-Chi. So you need layers to your deck building, and this is one of the examples of me adding layers. All right. So some final gameplay tips are, because I don't have any gameplay in this video, but I'll just give you some tips. You got to learn the meta deck list. How likely is the deck to run Shang-Chi? If you see Victoria in hand, are they running Shang-Chi or not? Relying on this information can be at a detriment, because sometimes people just put Shang-Chi in the deck, which really annoys me. But at this point, you know, respect them for being creative. I guess putting Shang-Chi into Victoria hand, very creative. As you can see, I've lost a few A-cubers to Victoria hand Shang-Chi. But for example, if they're running Cerebro, they're running Surfer, most of the time they're not running Shang-Chi. However, Surfer looks a lot like the buff decks, and the buff decks are running Shang-Chi. So, like, again, here's just how you're thinking about the meta deck list as you queue into every match. Doing the Ares math. I cannot emphasize this enough. Ares math helps you predict future draws, helps you predict when to stay, helps you read your opponent's hand. At the end of a game of Snap, there's only 6 cards in deck. When you play Ares on 3, you know 2 of the cards are going to draw, essentially, that they're likely to draw. And just this makes your cube equity a lot more high, essentially, right? Anticipating your future draws is a really important thing. Looking at my list 1, like, sometimes you don't have the energy to play 0 later on in the game, so you want to pre-fire 0, right? So that's can be pre-fired if you know, like, your likelihood of drawing. Like, I have a 50% chance to draw Starbrand, Typhoid, Rise to Red Skull. Okay, I'm going to pre-fire my 0 to make sure I have enough energy on the next turn, right? Zabu, Surge, anticipating your next draw so you can make sure you're playing the right card early. Like, should I play Zabu or Sauron? Well, if you're going to draw into a 4, then you should play Zabu. If you're going to draw into one of your negative cards, then you want to play Sauron early. And really, you have to look at your hand state in order to do that. And I can go over that in a separate video, but for now, that's kind of just my advice. Reading your opponent's snaps. You should be okay losing 2 to Shang-Chi. If your game goes on and you lose 2 to Shang-Chi, whatever. You're okay even losing 4 to Shang-Chi. Do not lose 8 to Shang-Chi. That'll just be a detriment in your climb. If your opponent has Shang-Chi and they're not snapping you, then whatever. A lot of people aren't aggressive snappers, so I will aggressively snap and still lose to Shang-Chi, but if it's for 4, doesn't matter. If it's for 8, I know they have a Shang-Chi. Essentially, on turn 6, if it's an 8-cuber, I know there's a Shang-Chi in the deck, and I will do everything to play around it or retreat for 4. And honestly, that's a good mentality. Sometimes your snaps, like, for example, if you're snapping after playing a Sauron, you know they have Shang-Chi in their deck. Let's say you play Sauron on 1. Well, it's like, okay, they can probably beat you because they're hoping on drawing their Shang-Chi. And then if they don't draw the Shang-Chi, they'll leave. So you can lock them into a 2-cube game. And so if you don't snap, the problem is you're always limping and you never know your opponent's hand, right? You don't know why they're staying. You just know they're playing the game out. However, if you show certain cards and then you snap, all of a sudden, you know your opponent's staying because they have an answer or they have a good game plan, right? So your snaps itself provide information based on your opponent staying. Last thing is just like learn alternative play lines. I think when most people are playing the decks, they think turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. There's a lot of information to process in a game of Marvel Snap based on locations that flip, based on what your opponent's playing, based on your hand state. So learn how to adapt to that information. And all these things are things I can go over in a future video. We're kind of pushing 40 minutes with this one. So I hope that you guys enjoyed the content. If you've made it this far, hopefully you learned 1 or 2 things. Hopefully you tried building your own Sauron deck. You can find me on Twitch at XenaidTFT, and honestly find me on Discord. My Twitter is the same as my Twitch, but I'm not really going to be doing too much on there. So yeah, my DMs are open. I really love playing this game of Marvel Snap, and hopefully you love watching me play, and hopefully you can learn some insight from my commentary. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for making it all the way through the video. Hope to see you guys next time.